Welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Amanda Glassman. I'm the Executive Vice President and a Senior Fellow here at the Center. And I'm excited to welcome today Rasmus Bech Hansen, who is the CEO and founder of Airfinity. We are in the week of the World Bank-IMF fall meetings, which is a time when some of the most powerful economies of the world get together to discuss priorities going forward for economic recovery, for the COVID-19 response. And we thought it would be a good time to really dive in to a very unique source of data and intelligence that is Airfinity and their COVID-19 manufacturing, supply, efficacy, and safety data about the COVID-19 vaccines. It's really a remarkable company that has been serving all kinds of not-for-profit and for-profit entities, just bringing kind of neutral information about where the market's going and what the volume of production is. So I'll turn it over to Rasmus, who will make a presentation, kind of deep dive into some of the issues that we read about every day, and then we'll have a conversation. You are welcome to submit questions via Twitter, #CGDTalks, or you can ask your question under the YouTube stream. So I'm going to turn it over to Rasmus. He is, as I said, the CEO, and he is really, you'll read about him in every newspaper article about the issue of COVID-19 vaccines, but Airfinity actually does more than just COVID-19 vaccines. So we'll also hear a little bit about that, how they collect their data, what those forecasts look like, and what the implications from this data are from his perspective. So over to you, Rasmus. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and good morning, America, and everyone else that listens in. Really excited to be here. Agree with Amanda that it's a big week. We've had several big weeks. We had the G7 summit recently. There was also very important milestone in terms of donation pledges, etc. And I agree this week will also be really important. Just very briefly, as Amanda says, Airfinity is a global health and science analytics company. We are trying to support decision makers around the world with better decisions based on real-time information and predictive analytics. If you look at the whole health space, I think we've seen and are seeing an explosion of data that has been in process for a long time, but I think a lot of that has been accelerated by COVID-19. And you know, the good thing about that is that it actually provides us with a better overview, better foundation for making key global development and other health decisions that we didn't have just a few years ago. And I think just want to also say that critical for me to say that Airfinity is an independent provider of data, and we see ourselves as a place that no matter what your political views are, you could come to us for as an objective view on different health issues as possible. So we work with Medicine Sans Frontières, Oxfam, many other great NGOs, but we also work with the industry, the IMF, and many countries around the world. And I would say all of these partners of ours help contribute to making the data as accurate as possible and as precise as possible. And I think it's really positive to see, although we've seen a lot of misinformation in COVID, we've also seen a lot of good information. And I think we've seen a lot of stakeholders coming together and agreeing that we should at least have an agreed evidence base that we can make decisions based on. I have agreed with Amanda that I would give a brief, at least fairly brief overview on where we see especially the critical issue of production and production scale up in the coming months, and how we are seeing the issue of stockpiling surplus doses and which countries that could go to. And then open up for a broad discussion on these topics, but potentially also broader health data discussions. I would also very much welcome. So I will share my screen now. Should be. Hope that works. If yes. Not, let me know. Perfect. It does. Okay, super. If we look at just briefly, kind of the high-level overview of COVID-19. We're still seeing very high level of cases globally. It looks a bit like a stock market ticker. It goes up and it goes down. We often ask, has the pandemic peaked? Has COVID peaked in a different country? And yes, sometimes it has, but then it might come up again. So it's a little, maybe not the most helpful thing to think about it as kind of peak and then it's down forever, but more kind of a thing that continues to change. And that's, of course, primarily driven by the highly transmissible Delta variant that's now prevalent in most regions around the world where we have data for it, except some parts of Latin America. I think one of the positive news, though, which is really important to stress, is that deaths are globally falling, and the fatality ratio, so deaths per infection rate, is falling as a result very much of vaccines. Not only vaccines, of course, also treatment has made some significant progress, but almost 30% of the world's population is now fully vaccinated. So that's quite a remarkable achievement, and is helping with decoupling the deaths and the cases globally, as we can see in the two lower graphs here. This, of course, this overall global view doesn't show how different the situation is from country to country. I think a good way of looking at the global situation is to look at vaccination rates, and so the population that is fully vaccinated. So we have that here on the vertical axis, and then looking at another data point, case fatality ratio, so which basically gives an indication of the risk you are of severe or death in a given country if you get COVID-19. That again depends on medicine availability, health system quality, etc. But if you look at it in a diagram like that, we can see that there is a group of countries in the lower right hand that has very low vaccination rates and very high case fatality rate. So I think when we talk about what could be done with vaccine doses that are not being used in high-income countries, that's really the key countries where one would say, you know, their vaccines would make a huge difference. We can get back to that, but a kind of a very unequal map of vaccine distribution, as I'm sure we all know. But I think one of the points here might also be worth noting is that there's, of course, a lot of focus on Africa, as that's the worst hit region and the one with the lowest vaccination rate. But there are actually several other countries around the world with high case fatality and low vaccination coverage, like Ukraine, Moldova, for instance. Romania is fairly low. So it's not. There are pockets around the world where we're seeing some unequal developments. There's no doubt that the vaccines has been a huge success, and I think it's worth pointing out that we are seeing still a significant investment in the R&D of vaccines. We have a lot of preclinical candidates. We expect a lot of them soon to be dropped, but still we're seeing investment both in phase 1, phase 2, and also some moving into to phase 3. So that bodes well for also a potential next generation of vaccine if the virus mutates further and we begin to see, as many scientists fear, we begin to see some more vaccine escape. So one thing has been the kind of scientific progress, and that's been immense. The other kind of, let's call it almost like a miracle in the COVID-19 pandemic has been the scale up of production. And if we look here at the production of the major manufacturers, we can see that the Chinese manufacturers have Sinovac has more than almost 2 billion. You see, Pfizer has also incredible increase in their vaccines, as the AstraZeneca vaccine also. And then there's some of the other vaccines that may produce slightly less than we had anticipated. And then a range of vaccines down here that we're still waiting for a significant ramp up. So it's kind of the vaccine they are dominated by a few large vaccine producers already, but we're seeing an underwood of more producers. Sorry. If we aggregate this number, we have around 7 billion doses have been produced to date, and just over the last month alone, 1.3 billion. So we are seeing a steady increase of production, and I would say we see very few examples of once a factory is up and running that it then starts to produce less and less. Once you have the yield in a given factory at a certain level, it tends to produce at a steady rate. That's at least what we've seen consistently throughout, and we don't expect that to change. So the 7 billion is frankly remarkable here in October, and we can see here which vaccines it is from. On a week by week basis, this changes a little bit week by week, who is the largest producer, but Sinovac, the Chinese vaccines, are continuing to produce at very high levels. Pfizer also increasing, and the AstraZeneca vaccine also still ramping up its production. Moderna somewhat less, and then Sputnik, the Sputnik candidate that I think had let's say promised a very significantly higher level of doses, they're struggling to deliver at the levels that and also at the number of agreements that they had. J&J also is slightly less than we had anticipated. And then there's a vaccine like Novavax, so it's of course really critical to low and middle income countries that we still haven't seen production output and hasn't been fully approved yet, despite really promising clinical trial results. We often get the question is, so if you look forward, so one thing is, what are the production we've seen so far? But of course, a really important question for decision makers is, what do we expect in going forward? And what we do is we developed a bottom-up methodology for forecasting production. So we identified all the production facilities around the world. We worked with the manufacturers and trying to understand that, and they've given us some information within the limits of what they could do without breaking any confidentiality issues. But that has helped us to understand what is the global supply chain looking like. And then we built these factory level output models where you can see kind of our forecast here and what has been observed. So generally kind of we're sticking to the line now. The observed is actually a little bit higher than we had forecasted back in February, but the line is more or less correct, and that's also why we are quite confident and why we've gone all out publicly with some of these forecasts. So how does that look? How do these forecasts look for the rest of the year? So we expect around 12 billion doses to have been produced by the end of the year, and we be somewhat the same proportion, primarily dominated by the Chinese vaccines and AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and then to some extent Moderna. But we do also expect to begin to see some of the other vaccines growing slowly. How that's going to all play out by mid next year, I think that's more question mark. But if the current production continues to scale up, we'll have at the current rates we'll have 24 billion by mid next year. I think at that point we will see a reduction in production capacity for some manufacturers. Some might also go out. So I don't think the 24 billion from that perspective is that realistic. But I think we will have the capacity to do that. And I think the key point here really is that vaccinating the world, looking into Q1 and Q2 2022, starts to be possible from a production perspective. We start to have, as a world, the vaccines that enables that. So even if you take the Chinese vaccines out of the equation, then by I would say May, June, we would be able to have enough vaccines to vaccinate 70% of the world and still providing boosters in the Western world. So I think these are very, very encouraging and very, very promising results. if we look at where these vaccines are coming from per country, then China is really the big story, big surprising story. I don't think anyone, and also we didn't anticipate that level of production from China and that level of export. India, starting out in the pandemic, India was a big vaccine producer, right? And now has been very much overtaken by India. US has scaled up very significantly, so has the EU. And those are the kind of the dominating forces. India, of course, from an export perspective, had played less of a role. Also, I think a surprise to many, but will start resuming their export I think in November. So all of this brings us to a view on how does this then look from a vaccine surplus dose perspective? And I think this is a piece of work we've devoted significant resources to, because it is, I think, really, really important. And I think we can all agree that it's in no one's interest to have wasted doses. It's no one's interest to have doses stockpiled that could have been distributed, could have saved lives, just sitting around. Not all of this information is fully public, so we have to base these stockpile analysis on the production we're seeing, the supply deals we know of, and the deliveries we're seeing. When you put all of this together, what we have here is a vaccine stock analysis showing what the key Western countries, US, UK, Japan, EU, and Canada, what level of stockpiles have they built? Are they building up, and can they expect over the coming months? And I think the figure is quite remarkable, that we expect that there would be 1.2 billion doses available for redistribution by the end of the year. In August, we saw a stockpiling of 150 million. In September, we expect us not fully have the data yet, but 185, and then it's growing in October and November. So significant stockpiling coming in. And here you can see the cumulative doses. The bottom here, and it's a bit of a busy graph, but the bottom here shows then the pledged donations from the same countries. We saw significant pledges from all of the countries last week. The US came out with an additional 500 million in doses, but I think one of the key things here is the time frame, because what this data basically shows is that these stocks are available for redistribution now, and what the announcement from the countries was more about was around mid-year next year. By September next year, these donations would happen. And I think what our data suggests is that it's actually possible to be more ambitious and start donating in larger quantities already now. Because also we have to bear in mind that the sooner the vaccines are donated or redistributed, the better for the receiving countries. So getting them all, say, at the end of the year in bulk would create large kind of logistical distribution problems, but also we would also run the risk that a lot of these doses would basically be expired, because typically a country would not accept doses until 2 months before expiry date, or after 2 months before expiry dates. So we have to be forward-looking in planning for these redistribution. And here, what we try to do is we look at the donation targets, and then we look at additional stock that further than these donation targets we're seeing could be redistributed. So the light blue lines here are the additional doses we believe from our analysis that the Western world has capacity to donate or redistribute. So quite significant numbers. If we look at which vaccines is it that then is available for redistribution, then not surprisingly from the production we saw, it is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, Moderna vaccine. There seems to be significant, we're starting to see some surplus. The AstraZeneca vaccine, Novavax, as we expect, coming to market, and J&J. that also, of course, raises some important questions of what do we do with the mRNA vaccines? How well are low and middle income countries set up to receive these? So I think there needs to be some very considerate thinking around which goes where and how do we solve the potential distribution challenges. So one way of thinking about that is that we now need a third miracle. We had the science miracle, we had the production miracle, now we need a distribution miracle to get these vaccines out globally and avoid them going to waste. Our analysis suggests that up to around 241 million doses could go to waste by the end of 2021, if some of these doses are not redistributed. And I think that's a burning platform, because every day, every week that goes by without redistribution, the risk of wastage is increasing, and of course, these vaccines could have saved lives. In the interest of time, I will jump a little over some of these slides. I would say that anyone who's interested in the underlying details of this, please don't hesitate to contact me or our team, and we will be able to support and help with these. If we look at a little bit of donations, I think it is very positive to see the recent donation pledges, and we are seeing a rapid increase in donations. So this stockpile analysis, I think, hopefully has helped contribute to that donation. The countries are realizing, we actually have surplus doses and we can count on continued supply. So the question is not so much whether that's happening or not. It's more like, is the timing, is it ambitious not? Is it happening at the scale that it could have happened? If we look at which vaccines are being donated, not surprisingly, AstraZeneca vaccine is the most donated vaccine, and of course, from both a cost perspective, it's cost significant less. It's AstraZeneca is still selling it at cost price around $5 per dose. And also from a distribution perspective, because it doesn't have the cold chain requirement that the mRNA vaccines has, it has some clear advantages in low and middle income countries. Just a few more points, and then Amanda, I think I'll hand over to open up for questions. But we often get the question, so what number of lives? And of course, that's a very difficult, but I think also important one to consider. How many lives could this actually potentially save? We are seeing, as I saw in the initial graph, we are seeing that countries with high vaccination rates have significant lower mortality. So there's no doubt that the vaccines work, and they are saving already have saved millions of lives. Part of the difficulty of estimating this, how many lives could be saved, is, of course, you have to estimate both the infection rates, the fatality rate in a given country, and many countries don't have the full data. So even a question like how many deaths has happened in a given country from COVID-19 is actually quite hard to answer, and ranges kind of go from the official 4.5 billion up to Economist has done, I think, some brilliant work on that, estimating more than 14 billion, real deaths. And so that, of course, impacts what is the number we estimate here, and therefore we're doing one with quite a big confidence interval. But I think it's fair to say, even under a very conservative estimate on infections, etc., then we are talking about more than 1 million lives that could be saved this year, and significantly more in early next year if these vaccines get fully redistributed. So rarely, if ever, have the world seen a situation where such a relatively easy policy actions could have such a significant impact. I think I will stop there and then open up for a wider discussion.
Thank you, Rasmus, for it's really rich data and something that everyone really has their eye on. Let me start with one question around sort of delivery dates that are implied in the contracts that countries are signing with the different companies. So, of course, there's the COVAX purchasing process, which is its own world. But countries themselves have made bilateral purchases and often say that their spot in the delivery queue is uncertain or late. Do you track sort of within these contracts, what are the delivery dates and how different are, you showed us how your forecasts link and what's happening with production overall. But what about the delivery process, or how well is the supply chain working? Is there some way to know that in the public domain? Just for our viewers, UNICEF does track the delivery dates that have been promised to the COVAX deliveries, if you want to look at that. But I must say that it's, not like the large volumes are still on the to-do list rather than implied in the data that's produced. But that's COVAX. What about the rest of the world and these? Do you have any insights into that data and what's going on?
I think it's a great question, and I think that you maybe split it in two. So that there's a question of what are the contracts actually saying, and here is the issue that these are confidential contracts that the governments and the pharmaceutical companies have agreed not to put them public. So we don't fully know the details of those. We know many of them do have both kind of an estimated delivery date, but I think also critically, some of them also have what is the sequence in the queue, so to speak. So I buy the right to get this and this number of the vaccines first from this and this factory, right? So and that's what many countries are saying. We can't just redistribute. And another issue in these contracts is also, it's not always clear whether a country can just redistribute those vaccines, whether they actually have the legal right to do so. So that's why I think the agreement we saw last week from the US government with Pfizer of the 500 million was quite significant, because that was basically saying, we buy those 500 million and then we can redistribute them to low and middle income countries, which kind of could indicate that the first vaccines that they bought didn't have that clause or that right in it. And from the manufacturers, of course, this also raises the question of the pricing and is that undercutting potential bilateral deals for those. So I think there is a really important global conversation to be had on these contracts and how they could be more flexible, because right now it's not so much a problem of, it's actually not so much a money problem, right? The money, COVAX has the money to buy more vaccines if they wish. It's more that it's not that easy for the countries to just resell them or donate them. And we know from our work with many of the Western countries that there is, it's probably not something they say aloud a lot, but there's an interest in potentially reselling. Because if you could have a marketplace for vaccine reselling, and then you can always agree, what pricing levels should we discuss. But I think there is already some like overall levels that are GDP adjusted levels one could start out with, right? But if there was a reselling agreement, one could have the hypothesis that would enable countries to better purchase surplus vaccines, and then they could, knowing that they wouldn't go to waste, but that they could actually sell them. And I think, for instance, for COVAX, COVAX can't facilitate a reselling agreement at the moment. And I think the kind of needs to, maybe more personal view, but it seems obvious to me that if there was this marketplace that could facilitate some. So that was kind of the first part. I think the contracts are really.
Can I ask you a little footnote on that one? You said COVAX can't facilitate that. They sort of had talked about something like that. Can you say a little bit about why that's difficult for COVAX to do right now?
Well, that was not what COVAX was set up to do, right? COVAX was set up to create a centralized purchase mechanism of vaccines that then could be redistributed. And I think if we look at how that has worked out, I think it's fair to say that the fully centralized system hasn't fully worked. I think we have to admit that. And even, again, no matter what your political view is and, international organization versus not, what the reality we've seen on the ground is that a country that's facing a pandemic will do everything it can to protect its citizen. And that's not going to sit around and say, oh, well, I'm waiting for my COVAX delivery. I'm not going to, talk to you, the manufacturers, and the manufacturers are not going to say, oh, we have an agreement with COVAX. We're not going to go to these countries, right? So there will be bilateral deals. That's the nature of this. And I think that a better, if the conversation, I think we should have a conversation globally. What is the right system for this? COVAX definitely has a lot of advantages. There is advantage to a partly centralized system, but I think it also needs to facilitate a bilateral system. And that seems to me that maybe the COVAX structure has been set up to be a little too rigid and not to allowing for some of this. Because I think part of the problem we're seeing with the bilateral deals is also that some of these countries, I mean, we've seen some horrendous stories of African countries paying more for vaccines than Western. It's crazy, and again, in no one's interest. And I think that's because the buyers on the country level side, and they're not always fully informed, and they don't have the procurement skill set, etc., to deal with these things. And that's where I think COVAX could really come in.
Yeah, those are really great and important points. And I think we have to acknowledge reality, as you say, and sort of try and build a system around that. I mean, an open question is who's in charge of that, because it's really no one's job at the moment. The question is, okay, are we going to ask the US government to do that on behalf of the rest of the world, or will these multilateral entities be able to evolve in that direction? So watch this space. I think when you started to make some of these points, but just to ask again, how easy or hard is redistribution? I'm going to refer to this article a couple of times because I just think I feel like this article is published every 2 days in the media. I'm thinking of the one from the Wall Street Journal from 2 days ago by Gabrielle Steinhauser and Denise Rowland that says, you say there's enough doses for everyone. Poor countries are still waiting. You've really sort of told us where are the vaccines in the system. You've suggested that reallocation is the way to go right now, but that you've also pointed to some kind of key issues around the contracts. What are the other difficulties with reallocating from a stockpile of purchase of vaccines that are coming into your warehouses, let's say in the UK or Canada?
So I think several things. I think one of them is that what in our conversations with the governments, they're saying, we kind of think your numbers are right and they're somewhat matched, but they don't always match on a per month basis. So the supply is quite lumpy, right? So you might know that by the end of the year you will have that, but you don't know exactly which months you have it from. And given that we are seeing it, soon to be expired, some of these vaccine doses, that is a real challenge, that you don't have like the fully steady kind of day-to-day supply. So I think many countries in that way, their stockpile information might actually be a little delayed. So that I think that's definitely one key issue. And I don't have a good solution for that, not other than maybe the manufacturers were more transparent about the deliveries, that could maybe support that, but also the countries I think could maybe also be more transparent, and also publish more of the exact stockpile. Of other challenges, I think what we also hear is that the ideal solution is not so much for the manufacturer to send them to a country that then sends them on to the recipient country, right? It would actually be much easier and much better for everyone if it was like sent directly from the manufacturer to the countries of choice. So I think that is that's what we should move towards, and it needs to be very close collaboration with the manufacturers and the countries in that regard. But then I think there's a whole question, and might get back to that, is where should they go, right? What are the actually countries that should receive these? And there again, we have the problems with the bilateral deals we're seeing, as I also pointed out in my presentation, we're seeing some countries that actually need it a lot, but they don't have the diplomatic clout or the agreements, etc., to make those deals, and therefore risk losing out, although they're probably where the vaccines could make the biggest difference. So one of the things that I think could also be really valuable for the global community to look into is whether there would be a more kind of data-driven way to distribute these vaccines. So I don't think infection rates is necessarily the right indicator, because you would always kind of be behind the curve, right? Once you see like infections going up, you see looking at an exponential curve, and that's actually too late to come in with vaccines. You need treatments, oxygen, and etc. But I think, for instance, part of what we suggested is case fatality, which is giving an indication of how risky is it to be infected in a given country. I think that could be, already a start to that. And I know COVAX has also done some really good work on trying to estimate the risk population in a given country. So the higher the number of, so the distribution would happen on a risk population adjusted basis, so to speak. So there are some things, but a more objective, evidence-based distribution system, I think, could be helpful.
Absolutely. And, when you talk about more transparency on deliveries from the manufacturing side as well as the countries, but could we pay for that, greater transparency to manufacturers as a product in and of itself? I'm just thinking, like, instead of just thinking about the contracts where we buy vaccines, could we actually say, hey, these 25 factories, I'm actually going to pay you to manage this data a bit differently and to put some of it in the public domain? Is that a crazy idea, or is that feasible?
I think everything is feasible if you're the one that's paying the bill, and who's paying the bill here? It's the countries, right? So ultimately, I would say the countries should could very forcefully push for some of this transparency. But I think what we're also seeing is that the countries are also a little reluctant to be fully transparent. It's not like the U.S. government has been fully transparent on the stock, information. We are having, discussion with them, trying to kind of point at what our data suggests and seeing where the discrepancy is. Of course, it is also a national security issue, of course. What are your vaccine stockpiles, and do you have enough to protect your population? And you might not want some of that out in the public domain. And say, for instance, there's around the world, of course, a big discussion on vaccinating children, right? What's the right thing there? And then if you're seeing that a country is like stockpiling to actually vaccinate the children, might be seen as a signal that they made that decision. And that could create a lot of political controversy. So I do understand countries' reluctancy to publish it all, but I think we could maybe find a little bit of a balance and getting a bit better views on this, and that could help everyone. Because really, I think one of the big learnings here also is, it's kind of said so many times, almost sounds banal, but it is, no country is an island, right? You're not protected if the rest of the world is not vaccinated. So there is this kind of direct national security spillover that we haven't seen so much in previous global health crises, right? So I think that could be an argument for why you would want that. And I think also you raised an important question: who should do this? I think that it's very clear who can do this. This is US, EU. If EU and US got together and agreed, we are going to distribute like this, we're going to donate like this, and it's going to be in this and this time frame. Moving away from these big pledges on long-term donation to kind of a timeline saying, in November we're going to donate this and this, in December we're going to do this and this, so everyone could plan around it. If EU and US, got together, maybe with Canada, maybe with the UK, and a few others, it would set the scene for the rest of the world.
Well, thanks for that great suggestion, because, I guess, was it only last week there was the summit held by Biden where they announced a new US European Union kind of joint action plan. They do talk about transparency in general terms, but I think it's important for us as a community to be specific about exactly what it is we'd like to see. And I think you've given us some really good ideas here. Let me ask you a second question. So we've seen that the Chinese manufacturers are the biggest producers in the world. Tell us a little bit about how their vaccine is being used. Obviously, they have a huge domestic requirement. We know that they're selling to other countries, but is there a China donation agenda here, given that they have the most vaccine and their vaccines are efficacious enough to stop hospitalization and death? Question to you about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly is China has had a twofold goal, right? They have a huge population, so they need really to scale up vaccine production to vaccinate and protect their country. I think if you just take that first, I think China it's interesting. It pretty much has still a zero COVID policy, right? Compared to many others. So, what does that tell us? Do they maybe, also their vaccines aren't as effective as the Western vaccines, and we know that they're investing heavily in mRNA vaccine. We expect a Chinese mRNA vaccine coming out sometime next year. So, are they going to keep this no COVID policy, where they have to close down a harbor with like 2 or 3 cases, and then it could be very disruptive. It's not also still traveling in and out of China. I think there's a really big question mark in the coming year what are they gonna do, because it doesn't seem to me that they have the protection level where they can really fully keep it under control. They don't have the vaccinated protection level, so they would need to continue, as it seems to me, with some of these other measures, or they would start to import vaccines. That's the other interesting thing, right? That could start to happen. And then I think from a foreign policy perspective, yes, clearly China has used this. I think that's it's very obvious when you see where they've struck their deals in Latin America and Africa, where they're sphere of interest. But I think when you ask these countries, so what do you think about the Chinese vaccines? I think many of them say we prefer the Western vaccines, but the Chinese vaccines is actually a really good argument for us to push the Western countries to donate. So in that way, I guess China has played a positive role also in encouraging the West to step up.
That's a really good point. Let me ask you a question. You mentioned that if we kept the pace of current vaccine production into from now into next year, that in about June we'd be at 24 billion total, and that more or less would be enough to amply cover all countries' 70% vaccination requirement, plus boosters, plus kids potentially. As you know, there's also sort of an effort to build regional vaccine manufacturing. Is there a market then for some of these regional investment efforts? What does it look like? Would they then be competing against the Chinese and Indian manufacturers, not to mention the US and otherwise? Sort of what do you see as the dynamics there going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is maybe slightly less data driven, a little bit more my own read of the market. I think what we're probably going to see is that these countries will be too late. The time it's taken them to set up a vaccine production, etc., at least for COVID-19, is so long that the existing vaccines would have such an advantage. It's even, coming out with a new vaccine now, it's hard to get the clinical trial data, right? How do you get, are you going to get your placebo groups, etc.? How are you going to get people to take that? So, and then the supply chain locking in, that's been part of, for instance, Novavax problem, right? And really established, very successful, very strong vaccine like Novavax. Problem scaling up because the other manufacturers had locked in the sub supplies. So I think it's hard to see that at a regionally produced vaccine. I fully understand I understand the motivation from a country perspective, but I also can't help think, vaccine production is a very difficult thing. It requires high quality control. We've seen a lot of these technology transfers not work out as well as many people had hoped, and actually the in-house production, end-to-end control seems to be working well. There's high economies of scale. We're seeing that the big factories are producing at higher yields, etc. So, the economic argument for a very kind of national or localized production setup doesn't strike me as particularly strong. I think really what's much more interesting to think about is how do we ensure these global supply chains? How do we ensure the distribution can happen? I think if we're seeing, say we are right now in a situation where we have one variant that is just much more transmissible than the others, right? So that's basically, in some ways, actually making our lives a little bit easier because, you know, Delta is just dominating. So as long as you have vaccines that work against Delta, it's fine, right? But, you know, earlier in the year, we saw the Alpha variant in Africa, and that had significantly lowered the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine, right? So South Africa went out and said, we don't want that, you know, we want some other vaccines. And, you know, imagine if they set the whole production setup for that vaccine and then they have a variant that doesn't work, makes much more sense for them to import what is a good a vaccine that works well against that. And, you know, it could very well be in a scenario that when new, more transmissible mutations have 2 or 3 that are equally transmissible, and then we have different variants around the world, and we would need 3 different vaccines. So, yeah, all in all, I think it's not on the production side, it's not on the supply side, it's on the distribution side. We need fresh thinking, innovation, you know, institutional setup, better data, and all of that.
That's a really great point. And you talked about that as the third miracle, the distribution miracle. And I mean, the other thing that strikes me, and I know that some groups are talking about this, like CEPI, but, you know, are we sort of intentionally investing in distribution innovation, in making sort of these second generation vaccines more usable? You know, is there enough of that going on based on market incentives, or is there a role for public subsidy there? That's one question. And then second, on this third distribution miracle, you know, you have noted that I guess 69% of donated doses are the mRNA vaccines that require cold storage. You know, if we're concerned, I mean, that sort of explains, and so we saw that there are a lot of AZ donations, but going forward, there's more Pfizer and Moderna, and actually people want that because of the, you know, their efficacy profile against Delta and things like that. But, you know, I don't see it's a kind of a huge intentional investment in just sort of getting this cold storage distribution working in most countries around the world, or do you monitor that, sort of what's happening with that kind of readiness? I mean, I know, you know, there was some stuff done by WHO and the World Bank that looked at readiness. Not a lot of detail on this particular category, other than sort of, are you ready, kind of, maybe for some populations, others not. What could we do to make that third distribution miracle happen from the perspective of these global entities?
Yeah, I think that, you know, another great question. I think that's really where international organizations could play a really important role. And I think one thing is investing in kind of a fixed infrastructure. And of course, that's long-term probably the best thing. But we also have to realize that it's a bit like, you know, when a regional war breaks out, you know, we might send Peace Corps, you know, or when an earthquake happens, we send, you know, a lot of supplies and help, you know. So one of the things that I think could be interesting to think about is, could there be kind of a more kind of flexible rollout system that probably would require both personnel, educated personnel, but I think there would be many distribution innovations that could also happen, you know, and I think public-private partnerships, just as we've seen in the vaccine production area, if we saw that in the distribution area, could be really helpful. I mean, we have seen successful vaccine campaigns in the past in Africa. We know it's possible. So if the political will is there, I think it you know, a lot could happen. And then I would also say that on the mRNA vaccines, that we are already seeing a really improvement in the requirements, in the cold storage requirement. So it's can last longer in normal and fridge temperature, etc. And I think it's, you know, I know it's one of the areas that both Moderna and Pfizer are investing heavily in. So I think over time that's going to be less of a problem. And then I would also just say that it's not like even the lowest income countries, they do have some capacity to take mRNA vaccines because they have urban areas where they have some of that cold chain requirement. So I think when we think about these, you often think, oh, kind of in a rural village, how's that going to work? You have no electricity, but, you know, there are many urban areas in all countries. So I think sometimes also maybe used a little bit as an excuse not to do it. And I think definitely the existing surplus we could easily find take us to that.
Yeah, Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll keep tabs on that and collect more information or more ideas. I think really on
Yeah,
delivery innovation. It's a great idea. I have a
yeah,
couple questions from the audience that I'm going to pose to you. Um, One question is, part of the presentations covering vaccine wastage due to expiry dates. Presumably, these are vaccines developed for earlier versions of the virus. This is sort of asking what is the level of protection that the existing vaccines offer against variants of concern like Delta, but also Mu. That's a very large scientific question. There's a whole literature on it. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the variants. I think it relates to this issue around what the demand for the different vaccines, right? Some vaccines are more effective against Delta and some somewhat less. I was interested to see Clover Biopharmaceuticals candidate come out, at least in press release, with trial data that show very high efficacy against Delta. So maybe you could talk about how those kinds of innovations might affect the demand for vaccines, and then what do we do with the vaccines that we have that might be less good
yeah,
against the
yeah.
new variant? What's your thinking on that?
So I think it's really important to say that the existing vaccines are all working well against the Delta variant. They might work slightly less than against the original strain, but they're still at a level that is high enough for regulatory approval, high enough for high level of protections. I think we thought that they might be less efficacious and that there would be a new generation of vaccines. We know that both Moderna and Pfizer had planned for that, and they actually, Pfizer had one that was developed towards, I think, the beta variant that seemed, but then they tested against the Delta, and the original vaccine was actually almost equally good. So there was basically there wasn't a strong scientific case to make the shift. So to answer the question directly, the existing vaccines there are no other kind of Delta. There is no Delta vaccine on the market yet, no approved Delta vaccine. So the vaccines we have are the original ones, and they're still working against Delta. We saw BioNTech coming out last week saying, we think there's going to be a mutation that requires a new generation of vaccines for booster shots, but even the boosters are the same as the original vaccines. So let's see that how that plays out. I would say, when the shift happens to a next generation, that was one of the things we were really concerned about going into the fall, is from a production perspective, that could set us back significantly, because you would have to stop the production for, I think we estimate like 6-7 weeks, where you couldn't produce to make the shift. And then you're kind of starting from scratch. Then you need, that vaccine to be produced and distributed, etc. So in that way, we're very lucky to be in a situation where the existing vaccines work well. Whether some of the new vaccines are going to work even better, that's still to be seen. I keep coming back to Novavax. That's just because they had very strong trial results. It's very well suited for low and middle income countries. So I would say that's probably the one I would point to as quite important for global development efforts, if that could be scaled up in production.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they filed for emergency use listing and for approval in a couple of countries. So that's really good news. One question is sort of, what's the timeline? I guess we're still talking about 2022 for Novavax, right?
Yeah, it is, and especially from a production perspective, that's been. But I think it was, as far as I remember, like 2 billion doses or something we thought we would have this year from Novavax. So it's very, very much below expectations. But then on the other, and then the mRNA has scaled much faster than we thought, and that the manufacturers originally said.
Okay, here's another question. Does Airfinity plan to add confidence interval estimates? If not, why? I guess that's on the forecasts. And then second, is there anything linking companies or sites that have underperformed production expectations, such as technology, location, ambition? Yeah, so more visibility on this, the performance of specific factories question. Is someone looking at, I'm sure someone is looking at that, but maybe you could advise us on that.
Yeah, on the confidence interval, I think that's also a good question. Yeah, so we do calculate that in. I didn't bring it all just for the simplicity, but we do have a confidence interval also in our projections, And I think generally, when you're looking at the forecast, we try to kind of have a very conservative estimate, both on the production, but also on booster usage, and who a country would want a vaccine in the kind of first or vaccinate in the first vaccination campaign. So these numbers of excess doses, so to speak, we believe are on the conservative side, but I think the confidence interval is a good point, and we do things like meta-analysis on vaccine efficacy, and there, of course, we have we only do we do the whole thing with confidence interval. And then on the production side, yeah, no, it's hard. I don't think we've seen any pattern, at least that I can point at. I think one observation though is that the technology transfers that are talked a lot about in developing world economics, etc., has not proven as quite as effective, I think, as we have thought. And I think it has to do with the way vaccine production is. It's very complicated biological process. The quality control is like more quality controllers in a factory than you have people who are doing the manufacturing or controlling that. So it is a very difficult task, and we're also seeing that some of these outsourced production or technology transfers, then it turns out that the output isn't the same, the vaccine isn't the same as the original. So there are some, I think we have to be realistic about how difficult that actually is when we're talking about vaccines. I think for other types of medicine, it's much more straightforward and simpler. Yeah.
Do you have like some data that you could share on sort of the number of technology transfer efforts undertaken and sort of what is the outcome of those? Well, we'll come back to you. I think we should do another event on techno transfer because, and the Novavax story is also about a lot of technology transfer agreements. AZ is another example. And I mean, I think looking at the experience of these companies in doing tech transfer and planning for it, is probably really instructive. I don't know if you have any thoughts on sort of learning from that experience so that we can do it better.
No, I think it's been partly, I think AstraZeneca is a good, they managed, now they're scaled up, but you're seeing a big difference from production facility to production facility. And for instance, the UK one is, as far as I know, the highest yielding one, which they are controlling quite closely, while some of the others are less so. And I think it's instructive to also look at Sputnik, talking about a technology transfer strategy. Yeah. That was Sputnik, didn't even have their own in Russia, right? And they just went out and did all these deals and then had these projections for I don't know how many. I think more than 1 billion vaccines, and we're just like, where's the output? Where's the output? Right? It wasn't coming, and I think it could also partly explain Novavax problem. In Novavax and Moderna, look at the two different strategies. Like Moderna saying, no way, we're going to produce all of this ourselves. Pfizer also saying, no way, we're going to take care of this. And that's actually working from a scale-up perspective. So I think there's food for thought.
Yeah, there really is. We think we really need to understand this well, and also, for governments, I'm thinking of Argentina, right? Who are like, oh yeah, we'll do a Sputnik factory here. You're partnering with a company that wasn't even manufacturing domestically. I mean, it's like the level of magical thinking was high.
Yeah, the skill set, who's going to educate your people to facilitate that? And I think also before you have your own factories, that's one thing I definitely say. Before you have your own factories, what good looks like, and you can produce high quality at scale. Forget about starting to transfer to someone else, right? And that's I think we are seeing that Pfizer now is starting to open up and say, okay, maybe we could make some deals in Latin America, because now we actually we know we have the skill set internally, and maybe also have sufficient people who know about it that we can send out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for this. We're now at the end, so I want to give you time to wrap up. But this has been really a fascinating discussion, and just starting from the data and sort of the facts and what that experience has been, I think is extremely instructive for how we shape the global effort going forward. And of course, as we were saying before, we're also in a new world where the manufacturing scale is completely different going forward, just an order of magnitude larger. But that also has big implications for what the global community does and sort of invests in. So maybe I'll turn to you for a few last comments. What would you say to a group of ministers of finance getting together in DC? I have my own views, but I will leave it to you for the final words. As you said, it's not so much about the money, but it does have a lot to do with thinking about the economic authorities' role in all of this.
Yeah, I think as I said, kind of, thank you first of all for inviting me. I think really hugely important week for the world. I think international organizations, government leaders, they have a really unique chance to make a big difference and make a distribution, the third miracle, the distribution miracle, happen, because all the components are there. It's not the money that's needed. The vaccines are starting to be there, so it's really just how do we make this work. And I think that if anything, a pandemic, if that could show that this is possible, it would bode really well for other future health crises and also non-health crises. So I think a lot is at stake, and I really hope that all decision makers will rise to the challenge.
Hopefully. Thank you so much, Rasmus, for a really great conversation. And I hope we can bring you back here at Center for Global Development to talk more about these issues in the future. But thanks so much, and thanks to the audience.
All for listening in. Thank you for some excellent questions. It was a pleasure to be here.